On Monday, we talked about the protective coverings of the brain. We talked about cerebrospinal fluid, how it is produced, how it circulates. Okay, so now we look at the brain, and some of these things we have already looked at in the lab. So I'm just going to reinforce some of those things, and maybe a few new ones. In the lab, we'll be doing the spinal cord, and I have also posted audio lectures on the spinal cord. Okay, so in case, if certain things are not clear, you can listen to that. This we should finish. If there's something remaining in this, then I will post an audio file for whatever we have not covered. But I think most of this, between lecture and lab, you should be able to get most of this. Structure of the brain now. And here again, I'll go a little faster because you have looked at the brain in the lab. Okay, so you know the 4 parts of the brain: cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, and the brain stem. So we start with the cerebrum. You know that there are 2 hemispheres, 2 halves, right and left cerebral hemisphere, which is separated by a deep fissure, which is called the longitudinal fissure. Okay, and in the cerebrum, you have 5 lobes. Okay, the cerebrum itself, which is the newest part of the brain. I told you this is the one that has developed a lot. In lower animals, cerebrum is not developed. In fact, it's highly developed in the human beings. Okay, which gives us some of those added advantages of thinking, language, emotions, all that. So there are 5 lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and a lobe that is hidden within the temporal lobe, which is called the insula. Okay.
So we call insula, like we consider it as a lobe?
Lobe, yes, you consider it as a lobe, yes. So that's the frontal lobe, which is the anterior portion of the brain, and then the parietal lobe, which is right up there, and the 2 are separated by a deep groove, which is called the central sulcus. Okay, and at the back you have the occipital lobe, and there is actually a sulcus here. There is a fissure that separates the parietal and the occipital lobe, like a little groove. We normally refer to that as a parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, because it separates the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. And then you have the temporal lobe, which is separated from the frontal and the parietal by this fissure, which is called the lateral fissure. And if you sort of move the temporal lobe a little, you will be able to see the insula inside. Okay, so if you move the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe a little bit, you're able to see the insula here. Now, in the cerebrum, please remember the outer, we did talk about this, 4 to 6 millimeters, the outer part, 4 to 6 millimeters outer part is gray matter. Okay, this is gray matter, which is the cell body of the neurons and the dendrites. We call this the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex. And the inside is white matter. Inside is white matter, which is the myelinated axons. Okay, so if you look at, let's go to this. Okay, we'll talk about all of these functions. I'm going to talk about that with the help of this picture. Okay, and we have looked at this in the lab. So if you take a look at these, you know what gyrus is. Gyrus is the elevation, sulcus is the depression. These folds, why do you see the folds on the brain? Because to pack a lot of neurons. Okay, so you have to pack a lot of neurons. So whenever there is a folded structure, it increases the surface area so that you can fit in a lot more cells. Okay, so let's start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of higher functions. Okay, so frontal lobe, especially this anterior portion of the frontal lobe, which is called, we are talking about the gray matter, okay, where the cell bodies of the neurons are there. So we are talking about the neurons and what is the function. So in the frontal lobe, the very anterior portion of the frontal lobe is called the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex. Now, the neurons that are found in the prefrontal cortex are responsible for some of your higher functions like cognition, that means understanding things, cognition, okay, personality, behavior, mathematical skills, recognition, facial recognition, a lot of the higher functions, okay, the neurons that are here, okay. The band of neurons that is just in front of the central sulcus, okay, so this is the central sulcus here, and this part, this red color, the band that is there, the neurons that are there, this is called the precentral, because it is in front of the central sulcus, so it is called the precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus. Okay, this region, the neurons that are found in the precentral gyrus are responsible for controlling all the skeletal muscles in your body. Okay, so the precentral gyrus, the neurons that are there, control all the skeletal muscles in the body. Or in other words, these are the neurons that are responsible for voluntary movement. They are responsible for voluntary movement. Okay, so this is called the primary motor cortex. This is called the primary motor cortex. Okay, and the portion, the neurons that are in front of the primary motor cortex, they sort of help in planning the movement, analyzing what needs to be done. So that is called the motor association area. So in front of the primary area, you will always have neurons which are called association neurons. So they are going to sort of help with the planning of the movement, making sure that it's going to happen correctly, how it should be, how should the movement be. So that's what they do. So it's called motor association area or premotor cortex. So it's the same thing. So it's the same way you will find association areas everywhere, okay? But this is just for completion's sake, I'm telling you. But what I would want you to definitely know is primary motor cortex, okay? This you need to know. Where is it found? Precentral gyrus, okay? What does the primary motor cortex do? The neurons that are here control all the skeletal muscles in the body. And you call these neurons, because they are the ones that are controlling the skeletal muscles, you call the neurons upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons. Okay? And another area, this is again in the frontal lobe. So you also have neurons that are going to control the movement of your eyes. So this is called the frontal eye field. Okay. So you can see there are separate groups of neurons that are controlling the movement. Okay, so this is just again for completion's sake that I am telling you. There is a frontal eye field. Not that I'm going to ask you about it. Definitely primary motor cortex you should know. And then the next area in the frontal lobe that you should know, you should be able to identify it in the lab. You should also know what is the role of this region. So there is a group of neurons which are there on the lateral aspect, okay, the outer aspect, not the inner aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the outer aspect, not the medial, the lateral aspect. So on the side at the lower border of the precentral gyrus, in front of it, you see a specific group of neurons which are mainly controlling the muscles of speech, okay, because there are so many muscles, your tongue muscles, your facial muscles that are responsible for speech. So this area primarily has neurons which have only one main function, speech. Okay, so this is called the Broca's area. Broca's area, or also known as the motor speech area. So the neurons here control the muscles that are responsible for speech, for talking. Okay. Now, if the neurons here are damaged, it will definitely lead to speech defects. Okay. So if a person has a stroke and the stroke damages the neurons in the Broca's area, speech will not be possible. Okay. So the term that we use is called aphasia. Aphasia means lack of speech, not able to speak. Aphasia. Okay. So damage to the Broca's area can cause aphasia, cannot speak. So that's why you see many elderly individuals, when they have a stroke, there is paralysis. And sometimes they're not able to speak. Their words are slurred. You can't understand. That's because these neurons are affected. Okay? So that is about the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe. Now coming to the parietal lobe. The band of neurons that are just behind the central sulcus. Okay? So that is the post-central gyrus. So now we are talking about the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe, post-central gyrus. The neurons that are in this region, the neurons that are in the post-central gyrus, receive all the information from your body part. So they receive sensory information. Okay? Neurons here receive sensory information from body parts. Okay? So this post-central gyrus is known as the primary somatosensory cortex. Primary somatosensory. Soma means body. So receiving the sensory information from the body parts. Okay. So what are the sensations that reach this region? That's the next question. Okay. So the sensations that reach the primary somatosensory cortex are sensations that arise from your skin and deeper tissues. Okay. What we call as general sensations. General sensations. What are general sensations? Sensations that arise from skin and deeper tissues. That is the muscles and things like that. So what are these general sensations? Touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, hot or cold, and the last sensation, proprioception. Proprioception. Proprioception is the sensation of the position of the joints and the limbs. So, how exactly is your limbs? Are you standing? Are you sitting? Is your joint flexed or extended? So, the body, the brain needs to get this information in order to maintain your balance. So, when you're jogging or running, your brain needs to know what is happening with the joints, what is happening to the limbs. Okay, so proprioception means sense of joint position or limb position. This is a very important sensation that comes from the muscles and joints. The muscles and joints, as they move, they send information back to the brain, to this region, okay, so that your brain knows what adjustments have to be made in order to maintain the posture when you are performing the voluntary movement. Okay? Yeah. Neurons here are able to identify it specifically as pain or touch or vibration or hot temperature, cold temperature. The neurons are able to do that. Okay? So that is about the parietal lobe, most important area where the neurons help. Okay, so remember this one. Now we come to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, the neurons that are in the occipital lobe receive information from the eyes. So now these are the general sensations. Okay, remember this. If you're asked what are the general sensations, this is the list. Okay, now the sensations that are specific to your special sense organs, these are called special senses, special sensations. Now, special sensations are those for which you have a specific organ, okay? It's not like the skin and things like that. There is a specific organ for that. So, vision is a special sense. The specific organ is the eye. Okay? Hearing, audition is a special sensation. The organ is the ear. Olfaction. Olfaction is smell. Sense of smell. That is a special sense for which you have special receptors in the nose. Gustation. Gustation is taste. This is a special sense for which you have specific sense organs in the tongue. Okay? So there are 5 special senses: vision, audition, olfaction, gustation, and the last one is equilibrium. Equilibrium or balance. This is a special sense. For this, the organ is the inner ear. Inner ear. Same thing here. It's the inner part of the ear. where you have the specific cells that are going to help you to hear. Okay, so these are called special senses. Now, these special senses are controlled, or the information reaches specific parts of the cerebrum. So, in the occipital lobe, everything that enters your eyes reaches the occipital lobe first. Okay, that's where the neurons here receive all the information from the eyes, then they analyze it, they interpret it, and you're able to see. So, this is called, the neurons here are referred to as the primary visual cortex. Primary visual cortex. So, occipital lobe is concerned with this. Vision. Okay. Now, audition, hearing, when you hear my words, it enters through your ears, it is translated or it is transformed into action potentials by specific cells that are there in your inner ear, and then the information travels through the nerves in the form of action potentials to the temporal lobe. Okay, so the neurons in the temporal lobe receive this. Okay, the neurons receive this. Olfaction, okay, smell. So there are specific cells in the top of your nose, roof of your nose, which detect the smell, and then they carry the information. Again, olfaction, the neurons that are capable of interpreting the smell, these are located again in parts of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So there are neurons that are scattered in the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Okay. So for vision, definitely occipital lobe. For audition, temporal lobe. Olfaction, parts of the parietal. So a little bit parts of the parietal lobe and also in the temporal lobe. Then gustation, the taste. Taste sensation, the neurons that are from the tongue, your taste sensations are carried finally to neurons in the insula. Okay, so the insula is responsible for taste. And then equilibrium and balance is also pretty much the same. It goes to parts of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So this is kind of scattered. Okay, yes.
So, I don't know if it's related, but like if you have really bad motion sickness, you have a little patch that you put like right down your nose,
Yes.
like the ear.
Yes.
Is that because it's right, like positionally, like it's kind of close to it? So
Yes. Motion sickness is due to, we have specific structures in the inner ear which detect the position of your body when you're moving. Okay. So in motion sickness, what happens? Your body is stationary, but then there are some liquids in that part which move, and that gives you a sensation of nausea and vomiting. So when that patch has a medicine that is going to settle that fluid. Okay, so you feel relieved. So when we do, like I said, for equilibrium and balance, the structures are in the inner ear. So you're going to see we have inner ear structures. There are two. One structure in the inner ear, which is called the cochlea, is responsible for hearing. Another structure in the inner ear, which is called semicircular canals, are responsible for equilibrium. Okay, so that when we do the ear anatomy, you'll be able to understand that. Okay, so that is about some of these areas. Okay, there are many. So all of this, how do we know? How have we mapped all this? How do we know that neurons here control vision? Neurons here receive all the information from the ears. This was mapped by a person called Brodmann. Okay, and if you look at any textbook, it will give you this name. It's called Brodmann areas. So he kind of, I don't have a picture of that. You can, all the parts of the cerebrum, you can number them. So everything has a number, like Broca's area is area 44. Primary motor cortex is area 4. This is primary sensory cortex is area 312. So he has numbered all the areas. He has studied it and numbered. It's called the Brodmann's areas. Okay, so we are not looking at all the Brodmann's areas, but some of the important ones. And I don't expect you to remember the numbers, but just remember where it is located and what is the importance of these areas. Okay, and all of this has been studied. Like I said, I'm going to show you this, the next one. How do we know that the neurons in the precentral gyrus control the skeletal muscles of your body? How do we know that this region, the neurons here, receive sensations from different parts of the body? How do we know that? This was done during neurosurgery, brain surgery. Now, brain has no pain sensation. There are no nerve fibers for pain. The meninges have. The meninges, dura mater, pia mater, all of that has pain nerve fibers. But the brain tissue itself has no pain. So when you need to do surgery on the brain, you just need to give local anesthesia. The person is conscious. You just need to numb the skull and the tissues inside. That's it. You don't need to give general anesthesia and make the person become unconscious. You don't need to do that. So you give local anesthesia, you make a hole in the skull bone, okay, it's called a burr hole. You drill a hole, take out that piece of bone, then get into the meninges and get into the part of the brain that you want to work on or do the surgery. So when brain surgery was being done, and when the surgeon is touching different parts of the cerebral cortex, the patient, if the surgeon touches the primary motor area, that is the precentral gyrus, then automatically the finger will move, because the neuron that is being touched is the neuron that is controlling the skeletal muscles of the index finger. If the surgeon touches the neurons that are there in the primary sensory cortex, so then the patient is going to say, oh, I feel a touch sensation in my little finger. So that is how they were able to map the entire human body on the cortex. Okay, so you can actually draw the map of a human being on that precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. You can map it. Okay, exactly which neuron is doing what. You can do the same thing with the temporal lobe, auditory cortex, visual cortex. You can do the same thing. Now this map is, if you look at it, it looks pretty distorted. It doesn't look like a normal human being. The face looks so big, the hands, the thumb and fingers look so big, whereas the trunk and lower limbs look very tiny. The same is seen here as well. This is the motor cortex, this is the sensory cortex. Now, why is the face and the lips and the hands having such a huge, so many neurons are devoted to this. So many neurons are devoted to this. A huge chunk of the neurons is devoted to hands and fingers and the face in both the sensory cortex and the motor cortex, whereas the trunk and legs and all that have a very, compared to this, it is much less. Now, this is because the reason is, these are the areas, the face, the hands, these are the most sensitive areas where you have a lot of receptors for all of this. Okay, when we did skin, we looked at receptors on the skin, Meissner's corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles. So the skin of the hands and the fingers and the skin over the face has maximum number of sensory receptors. It is the most sensitive regions. So that's why they have a larger number of neurons sort of controlling that or receiving information from that part. Because every point is very sensitive. You have receptors. Because these are the organs, these are the structures that you're going to use when you want to do some work or feel something, understand something, touch it, feel it. So that's what this is, okay? Same way, in the motor cortex, the ones that are controlling the muscles, also the fingers and the face, because these are the muscles that we use a lot. So all fine movements, precise movements, when you want to draw, when you want to write, when you want to play a musical instrument, all of this, the hands are the most important. So these muscles are very precisely controlled. Facial muscles, we speak, so muscles of speech, and then facial expressions, which is if you just look at which are the muscles in the body that we use maximum, it is the facial muscles, okay, because we eat, okay, at least minimum 2 to 3 times a day. We use our muscles of chewing. When we talk, automatically, subconsciously, there are facial expressions that are happening. So these muscles are maximally used, and that's why you see such a big chunk of neurons devoted to this, okay? So it's fascinating when you see how we still do not know a lot of things about the brain, but what we know itself is very fascinating, okay? So these are, you can actually draw a map, and we call this the homunculus. Homo sapiens is human beings. Homunculus means little man, small man, culus, little man. Okay, so you can draw on the sensory cortex, you can draw a little person. On the motor cortex as well, you can draw a small person. Okay, and then another thing that I also want to highlight, of course, this is out of importance now. This. Now, I told you about the Broca's area. Okay, I told you about this. This is the motor speech area. Now, there is another region which is sort of encompassing the parietal lobe, part of the occipital lobe, and part of the temporal lobe. So it is a region which is kind of like the junction between the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. The neurons in this region, and this region is called the Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is one that I want you to know. It's the motor speech area, and this one is called the Wernicke's area. So where is the Wernicke's area? It is the junction of the parietal, where the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe meet. Okay, that's where you have the Wernicke's area. The neurons in this region are responsible for interpretation. They actually interpret the things. It's referred to as the global interpretation area. Global interpretation area. So anything that you see or hear or feel, the analysis and interpretation of what you're hearing, what you're seeing, or what you're feeling is done by neurons here. So it's a very important region of the brain. Okay, just to give you, like a very simple example of this. Okay, if you are asked to read something, okay, you're given a book and you're said, okay, read the first paragraph. So what actually is happening is you are looking at the page, you're looking at the paragraph, the signal goes from your eyes to your visual cortex, okay? And then from the visual cortex, there are fibers that connect to the Wernicke's area. So the Wernicke's area is going to, when you look at it, before you start speaking it aloud, the Wernicke's area, you're going to see it, quickly glance through it, and you're going to see whether there are any words that you don't know how to pronounce the word. So it's going on. So that general interpretation about what you're reading, what you're about to read, that is done by this region. And then the neurons from here, they send information to the Broca's area and to the motors area, which will then activate the muscles of your speech, muscles of your tongue and lips to read out the words. Okay? So this is where that interpretation occurs. Whenever you're asked to do something, you look at it and then you are kind of thinking about how to do it. Okay? It may not take a long time. It may just take a few seconds. But that interpretation is happening here, okay, where everything comes together. Now, if you're asked, if somebody whispers something in your ear, you know, there's a game where you whisper words and then you have to repeat it to the other person. So when you whisper a word and you're asked to say what the word was, it goes through your ear and then it'll reach the temporal lobe, which is where all the auditory information reaches. It'll reach the neurons here. Then it'll go to the vernix area, where you're going to understand, okay, what was that word that was whispered in my ear? So you're going to understand that. And then it'll be again passed on to the Broca's area and the primary motor area for you to say the word out loud. So kind of like, it is a very simple example. It is more complex than this, but this is what happens. So this is called the general, global or general interpretation area. Okay, so I want you to know about Broca's area and I want you to know about the vernix area, because these two are important components. Do the two cerebral hemispheres talk to each other? Do they exchange information? Because you know, right and left cerebral hemisphere. Yes, information from the right cerebral hemisphere will be shared with the left cerebral hemisphere. Information from the left will be shared with the right through this band of white matter, which is called the corpus callosum. Okay, so the corpus callosum is the myelinated nerve fibers that are connecting the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so this is white matter that is called commissural fibers. So they connect. So even if you sort of block the vision, if you put a board and block the vision, anything that is seen by the right eye, you can actually speak it out. Okay, it will be shared, and you know, there are tests to do this. So you can ask them to see something with the right eye and then draw it with the hand. So you know, you're able to make out that information is shared. Now, one thing that most of you probably already know is that each cerebral hemisphere controls the opposite half of your body. The right cerebral hemisphere, okay, controls all the muscles on the left half of your body, and the left cerebral hemisphere controls all the muscles on the right half of your body. So the motor cortex that we said, the primary motor cortex. Okay, the reason is because the axons that are coming down, they cross over. Okay, they cross over at the level of the medulla oblongata. When we do the spinal cord, you will see they cross over. So that's why the right cerebral hemisphere controls all the muscles on the left half of your body, and vice versa. Okay, the same is true for sensations. Sensations that come from the right half of your body reach the left somatosensory cortex, and sensations from your left half of the body reach the right somatosensory cortex, because again, the fibers that are going up, they cross over. Okay, so it is the opposite half. So let's say you see a patient who has paralysis on the left half of the body. All the muscles on the left are not working. That means the problem is in the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, that's where the stroke has happened. So that's an important concept. But although the two hemispheres receive information from opposite halves of the body, they do share it. Okay. The sharing occurs through the corpus callosum. That you might have red, or you might have. Now, this is a good table for you to understand the different. Quickly look at the functions, and this is what you need to know. This is what you need to know. So, in this, let me just highlight, you should know primary motor cortex, okay, that whole thing. Then, primary somatosensory cortex, okay. So, this. Primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, gustatory, that is taste, okay. So, don't worry about the association areas. Olfactory, okay, Broca's, vernix. Okay, these are the ones that I want you to know. Okay, and of course prefrontal cortex, prefrontal, because it's for planning, personality, and higher functions. Prefrontal. So know these well. Okay, so now we have finished the cerebral cortex. Okay, the cerebral cortex is done. Now, the inner part of the brain is white matter, okay, inner part of the cerebrum. Let me talk to you about this first and then. So, you see this is the cerebral cortex, which is the grey matter. The inside of the cerebral hemisphere is white matter. What is white matter? It is myelinated axons, bundles of myelinated axons. Bundles of myelinated axons, the term that we give for this we call them tracks. We call them tracks, like pathways, tracks. Okay? So, they look white in color because of the myelin. So, within the white matter of the cerebrum, you are going to see these tracks going from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. You're going to see white matter that is connecting the neurons in the same cerebral hemisphere, the one that you see in green here. And you're also going to see white matter, myelinated axons that are going to go down through the brain's, the thalamus and the midbrain and brainstem to the spinal cord. So you're going to see lots of connections. So connections between the right and left cerebral hemisphere, connections within the same hemisphere, and connections between the neurons in the cerebral cortex and the neurons in the spinal cord. Okay? So there are three types of tracts that you're going to see. Okay? Now the tract that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, you know that is the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is made up of fibers which are called commissural fibers. Commissural fibers. Commissural fibers connect two halves. So, from here to here, this is commissural fibers. You find it in the corpus callosum. What is it? It is just white matter. It is just white matter. But these are fibers that are connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. Now, the fibers, the myelinated fibers, that axons that connect neurons in the same cerebral hemisphere, these are called association fibers because they connect the neurons in the same cerebral hemisphere. And then the tracks that go from the cerebrum all the way down to the spinal cord, these are called projection fibers. Projection fibers. Okay, so when you look at the tracks, there are commissural tracts, which are corpus callosum. Okay, the example is corpus callosum, connecting the two hemispheres. Association tracts, which are connecting the neurons in the same cerebral hemisphere. And then lastly, projection tracts. projection tracks which are going to connect the brain with the spinal cord. So we are going to, when we do the spinal cord in the lab, we are going to look at this projection tracks. What are the main types of projection tracks? Okay. So within this white matter of the cerebrum, there are collections of gray matter. Okay. So deep within the white matter of the cerebrum, so this is a, what should I say? It's a sagittal section of the brain. Okay. So you see the gray matter of the cerebrum, you see the white matter, you see the thalamus. This is the thalamus. Okay. The diencephalon, the thalamus part. Now within the white matter of the brain, the cerebrum, you are able to see collections of gray matter. So there are neuron cell bodies which are found within the white matter of the brain. Okay? They are much more deeper. You can't see them very easily. They are deep in the white matter. Now we call this the basal nuclei. They are called basal nuclei. What are basal nuclei? Deep within the white matter of each cerebral hemisphere, there is a cluster of cell bodies of neurons. Basal nuclei. Okay? Now that's all I want you to know. Deep within the white matter, neuronal cell body. Now, basal nuclei, there are many parts to it. These are the names: caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus. Don't worry about these names. Okay, I want you to know what is basal nuclei, and I'm going to tell you the function of basal nuclei. Okay, that is what you need to know. And again, I have explained this function of basal nuclei in the audio lectures on spinal cord as well. It is there, but I'm going to tell you what it is just now. Okay. About the different terms. This is a complex part of the brain. Don't worry about these different areas, what they are called. Just remember it that this is deep within the white matter. It is cluster of neuron cell bodies. The basal nuclei are involved in the control of voluntary movement. Okay. In other words, they are controlling your skeletal muscles, but they are only involved in it. They are not actually controlling the skeletal muscles. The actual control is from your primary motor cortex. The neurons are controlling your skeletal muscles. These are involved in the control. So what is this involvement? Okay, they help in the planning of the voluntary movement. Along with the primary motor cortex. So they help to plan the movement. That is one. One function is plan. So this is actually under this, okay? Involved in the control of voluntary movement. What is that involvement? They help in planning the voluntary movement. Okay, second, they help in initiating or starting the movement. Help in starting the movement. Okay. And lastly, the basal nuclei, not lastly, third thing, they inhibit added movements. They inhibit involuntary movements. So when you're performing a voluntary movement, you don't want any shaking or tremors. So they inhibit involuntary movements of skeletal muscles. so that the voluntary movement is precise. Okay? So inhibit involuntary movements of skeletal muscles. If you're not sure what involuntary movement means, you can write down tremors, shaking, unnecessary shaking of the muscles. That is involuntary movement. Okay? Involuntary movements of skeletal muscles to make movements precise. So the movement is very precise and accurate. There's no unnecessary movement which might hamper the actual voluntary movement. And lastly, the basal nuclei are responsible for certain subconscious movements that accompany a voluntary movement. I'll explain this to you. So it is the basal nuclei that are necessary for certain movements which you perform subconsciously. So for example, when you walk, none of us walk like this. Okay, we don't walk with our arms on the sides like a stiff march. We don't do this. Subconsciously, when you're walking, your arms are swinging. Okay, you may be swinging it in different ways. Each of us has a different gait. But subconsciously, your arms swing. You're not doing this consciously. You're not aware of it. The walking is your voluntary component. You decide, okay, I want to go jogging. I want to go for a walk. But this happens subconsciously. Okay? This is brought about by the basal nuclei. Now, when we talk, subconsciously, our facial expression changes. When we meet a long-lost friend, we are happy. So our facial expression changes. We light up, we smile. If you're talking to somebody who's just had a sad event in their life, your facial expression automatically becomes, you're not going to smile, it becomes subdued. So these are subconscious. You're not planning it. You're not saying that, oh, I need to show that I'm sad. You're not doing that. It subconsciously happens. So that is the basal nuclei. Okay? So example for this would be swinging of the arms while walking. And the second example would be facial expressions that accompany speech. Okay, so these are controlled by the basal nuclei. Now, a lot of times we are not aware of how important these are. Why? Because we are all normal. So we assume it, we take it for granted. Only when you lose it, you realize what it is, what is the importance of this. So a person who has damage to the basal nuclei will not be able to initiate a voluntary movement. Even to get up from the sitting posture is going to take a long time. To start speaking will take a long time. They may have it in their mind, but for the words to come out of the mouth will take a long time. And when they perform a voluntary movement, there will be tremors. They cannot perform it precisely. Okay? And you will see that they will have a mask-like face because no facial expressions. And when they walk, the gait will be shuffling like that. Arms stiff on the sides and a shuffling gait. Now, these are things that are very characteristic when somebody has damage to any part of the basal nuclei. Okay, so this is what all that I want you to know about basal nuclei. Okay, to basal ganglia. So this is deep in the cerebral hemisphere. That's where it is. Now, the diencephalon and you have, there are certain other parts of the brain which are not specific. Like we saw the parietal lobe, occipital lobe responsible for vision and things like that. There are some parts of the brain where it's not localized. So many neurons take over the function. Okay? So one of them is what is called the limbic system, which is there in the cerebrum. The neurons, limbic system is otherwise known as the emotional brain. Okay, this is called the emotional brain. So there are many parts of the cerebrum that form the limbic system. So the limbic system is basically, hypothalamus is part of it, okay, in the diencephalon, hypothalamus, but there are two areas. And again here, I just want you to know what is the function of these parts, okay. These two regions, the limbic system, remember these two regions, hippocampus and amygdala. I'll show you where they are. So this is your thalamus, the diencephalon, okay. So these neurons which are kind of scattered all over, okay, right here is the hippocampus and the amygdala. So there are lots of neurons in the cerebrum, both cerebral hemispheres, surrounding the diencephalon, okay, and close to the corpus callosum, which are responsible for some specific functions, okay. We call these neurons, this group of neurons, as the limbic system. Limbic stands for emotional. And two parts of the there are many other parts of the limbic system, but the two parts that are of importance are hippocampus and amygdala. Now, you can't see this with your naked eye, neither can you even differentiate it under the microscope. You can't. It's just by doing a lot of research, you know what these neurons are responsible for. So, amygdala, okay, I want you to know the function of these two. That's it. Limbic system, remember this as the emotional brain. What are the two main components of the limbic system? One is hippocampus. Now, hippocampus is responsible for memory, short-term memory. So whatever you're hearing now, whatever notes you're taking now, ultimately reaches the hippocampus. This is where it goes. Okay. Now, this memory lasts for about maybe 15 minutes to half an hour. So if you meet someone along the way and, you know, in between a class, somebody whom you have not seen, you meet your friend and then you say, okay, let's make an appointment to see each other on this weekend. Okay. So, and the person tells you, okay, let's meet here. So that is short-term memory. You will remember it, okay, for some time. But then it will get wiped out the moment something new comes in. So the hippocampus is responsible for short-term memory. And then when you keep thinking about the same thing or studying the same thing, learning the same thing, from here, it gets converted to long-term memory, okay? So you have short-term memory and then you have long-term memory. So hippocampus is responsible for short-term memory. And long-term memory is usually stored in the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe. That's where it is stored. So that's why you're able to remember it, because it is stored in the synapses. But this one lasts for a very short time. So suppose you have, to give you a context for this, suppose you have a person has experienced stroke and the hippocampus, the neurons here are damaged. Then this person will lose short-term memory. They will lose short-term memory. So if you ask them, what did you have for breakfast today, they won't remember. But if you ask them what happened 10 years before when you were living in this place, they will remember that, because that is long-term memory which is stored in a different place. So they'll remember that, whereas this will be lost. Okay, so usually when people experience a road traffic accident, sometimes they forget what happened just before the accident. The reason is because of the impact of the brain. This hippocampus is kind of jolted shocked for a short time. So the short-term memory goes away. Okay, so there are lots of different types of dementia, okay, with old age, where people remember what happened many years before, but they will not remember what happened just that morning. Okay, it's called short-term amnesia. Amnesia means lack of memory. Okay, short-term amnesia. Where they forget things. So the hippocampus is where short-term memory is residing. Okay, and of course, only when things go here, it can then become long-term memory. So hippocampus is responsible for learning and memory. Okay, amygdala, on the other hand, this is the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for emotions. Okay, amygdala is responsible for emotions, especially emotions that are anger, rage, fear. Okay, so those are the neurons that are there in the amygdala. Amygdala. Okay, this is responsible for emotions like anger, rage, fear, sexual emotions. That's what the amygdala is known for. Okay, so more importantly, fear, anger, and rage. Okay, that's where amygdala comes in. Okay, so that is the limbic system.